Okay. Thank you all for joining us in the Conflict Consortium virtual workshop. We have with us Molly Inman, and Jennifer Whitten-Woodring is going to get us started with comments. Jennifer.
Thanks. So Molly, I enjoyed reading the paper, and I particularly like that you're trying to untangle the effects of ethnic parties, because as you point out, there are certainly important policy implications here. I also like your level of analysis, the ethnic group year, because it allows you to really take into account the non-event as well as the event. I did find your presentation of your theory and hypotheses a bit confusing, and because of that, I really think you need to consider reframing how you present them. Not so much changing, but reframing how you present them. Because on the one hand, you start out by arguing that there's no reason to believe that the presence or proliferation of ethnic parties is likely to lead to an increase in violence against the central government. But then on the other hand, you say, well, actually indirectly in a roundabout way, maybe with certain combinations and levels of intra-ethnic competition, specifically high intra-ethnic competition, we could actually see an increase or the presence of inter-ethnic violence, which in turn can lead to central government violence against an ethnic group, which could in turn provoke rebellion. So it's kind of a confusing argument, and I actually find the second argument that you make much more compelling. I also like your use of ideal types and your explanations for the varying potentials for ethnic conflict, inter-ethnic conflict in each. And I think you really need to reframe your hypotheses to test these. Specifically, this idea that the effect of ethnic parties on inter-ethnic conflict varies and is different if there are no ethnic parties versus one ethnic party versus multiple parties for the same ethnic group. And so that's my primary criticism. Along these lines, when in your methods section, when you talk about your variables and you categorize them, right now you're listing government use of violence as a dependent variable, but you actually use it in your models as an explanatory variable. And similarly, you're listing inter-ethnic violence as a control variable, but you use it in your model as a dependent variable. And finally, one thing that I would urge you to consider carefully, because I'm sure it might come up from others as well, is the issue of reverse causality, that rebellion could actually be what's provoking government violence. And that's it in a nutshell.
All right, great.
Can I jump in right there, just because that's come up before?
Yeah, so we'll give you a minute or a couple minutes to go ahead and respond to those issues. And whenever somebody has one finger or a two finger, go ahead and jump in. Right now the queue is wide open. So Molly.
Okay. Thank you very much for your comments, and to everyone for reading the paper and for your feedback. Maybe I'll go in reverse order. On that reverse causality, that's come up, actually I think more with me and Hannah talking, but I haven't come up with a way around it. Do you or anyone else have suggestions on how to test the theory and to eliminate that rival hypothesis of the reverse causality, given these data or given potentially other data that exist? So that would be one big question. And I hadn't thought about it, using the ideal types as the hypotheses to test. Those are a very recent addition to the paper, because I felt like the theory was even less clear before. Hopefully that clarified it a little bit. But that would be really useful. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at the data and see how much purchase there would be in being able to test them with what I have right now.
Am I supposed to just talk?
Sorry, I was slow on muting. Jim on a 2, and then I've got a 2.
Yeah, I sort of had the same read about the ideal types. If you mean by the ideal types the scenarios, I have my notes here, I'm looking at them. The different scenarios about the different possible conditions under which ethnic parties might find themselves within countries, if that's what you're talking about. You know, I guess that, you know, the purpose of that was to clarify sort of your theory and your expectations. But as the reader, I kind of felt like, well, she's going to test this, you know? She's going to develop dummies of all these different ideal types. She's going to go through all of her different ethnic parties, create dummies, and put them in her model. I mean, that would seem to me to be pretty easy. You know, I don't know if you want to respond to that, if there's something you thought about, or cast them in a different way that doesn't create that expectation.
Okay.
Okay. Rob on a 2.
Well, I mean, I don't think that you. So I had a similar thought. I thought that this was going to be where you were going to be going with the empirical testing. And to be honest with you, I thought this was going to turn out to be something like. I mean, I don't think you have to necessarily dummy out every one of these things, right? I think it might make more sense because oftentimes you're talking about how the number of parties is sort of the effect of the number of parties is contingent on other things like the size of the ethnic groups or the amount of fractalization, and so it might not be that you have to go in and sort of code every one of these things as a dummy necessarily, right? I mean, this is just very natural interaction land. And you know, there are ready-made measures that would be able to give you some crude first cut about whether or not the number of parties, whether that effect is contingent on some of these other things, and that, thankfully, that would be a relatively easy addition to make.
Okay.
And as for the other thing, you would do a 2-equation model, right? You would model both processes going on at the same time in terms of the reverse causality question, right? Mm-hmm. You would just model them both, and you'd have to make some annoying exclusion restriction, but such is life. And I don't think it would be that hard to find things that would predict each of the 2 processes uniquely, which would be like what you'd need, right? That would still be pretty okay. You might end up with messier inference, but that would be a pretty small price to pay to not have these annoying questions about endogeneity, I think.
Okay, I've also.
Oh, go on.
No, go ahead, Jim. Are you following up on this?
Because the structure of the MAR data means you can't. You could use lags, right? Is that correct, Molly?
You could use lags. You lose some data, right?
Okay.
A lot.
Okay, then maybe the two equation. You know, as a consequence, you know, with endogeneity, it's not something that it's a perennial problem, and it's not something we have an enormously satisfying range of tools to deal with. I mean, people are pretty divided on how to solve that problem. I didn't know if lags were a possibility. I didn't. You know, with my recollection of what the MAR data looks like, it's not like you have a lot of years of observation.
Right.
So I have a response on that as well, and I also just want to share that I got an email from Dawn, and she doesn't like to use systems that share a lot of information, and wasn't really aware that doing a Hangout was going to be one of those kinds of systems. So she's going to email you her comments.
That'd be great.
Unfortunately, won't be joining us this morning. I had the same reaction on the reciprocal relationship, and you know, as Jim observed, this has been a problem. Not all of my work, but a good majority of my work has gone single equation, but we know it introduces a non-trivial bias, and so working on solutions is really important. The question I had for you is, it seems to me that you're actually interested, and I may be just reading this poorly, but that you're actually interested in onset. So you make distinctions early on in the paper about whether in your argument that it's responding to government provocation that you would expect these majority groups to do, but that they would not, you know, engage in onset. So I was actually surprised, curious how you were going to address that in operationalization and in measurement, and you don't. But it seems that there are some options that would also help you address this this issue of endogeneity. And if you only looked at onset years, for instance, and coded them only when they were in response, although I'd have a whole bunch of questions about how you would figure that out and a whole bunch of concerns there. But if you did that and then did the lag, the preceding year's level of coercion, that would, it seemed to me, get at that argument that you were making. But I'm not sure, am I foisting an argument on you that you weren't making, or is that actually the argument you're making?
No, I think that's the argument. I hadn't thought about it in terms of onset versus continuing conflict. I guess the distinction isn't that important to me, but I think my argument is essentially about onset.
Okay, and you could then lag the preceding year, which would get you some purchase in a single equation setting on the endogeneity issue.
Yeah, there is a problem with losing a lot of data, but it might be worth it.
Well, if you really do want to focus only on those instances, and I'm not sure that you do, but if you only want to focus on those instances where you can make some claim about provocation, that's not your term, that's a term I'm throwing out there, so please feel free to give me a better way to describe it. But in response to the state effectively acting first.
Right. Okay.
And I have Emilia on a two-finger, and have I missed anyone? Because I was yakking, and so I'm definitely not paying attention. Okay, I got a one finger in Michigan. Okay. Emilia? Emilia, you're mute. There you go.
No. Okay. So I want Molly to realize that my comments are going to be from someone that doesn't do research on rebellion or civil groups. But I think it's valuable because a lot of times the people that will be reviewers on your research may not necessarily do the exact thing what you're doing. Mm-hmm. So these are more general ideas from me, how to make your argument more clear. Okay. So the first thing that jumped out to me when I read the abstract is that it was so detailed that I lost the argument for the detail. You see, I read the abstract several times and I really couldn't capture what is this that you're set to do. Now, granted, I don't think this is because I'm not in the literature here. But, I just would like to see one sentence that's very clear, to the point, this is what I'm doing, this is why, and these are my empirical tests.
Okay.
So I really would encourage you to start rewriting your paper in that sense. And the same thing followed all the way through the theory, which has a lot of very interesting details and literature review, and you just, you mention what other people are arguing and you criticize them, but then I'm losing the argument.
Okay.
And I think a lot of the comments that you got in the past 20 minutes perhaps stem from that a reader that may be not as well immersed in the literature is simply wondering, what is this that you want to do? Okay?
Okay.
Now, granted, you know what you want to do, but I need to know.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So this has been through several iterations, and you should have read some of the previous versions. This seems like radically clear compared to those versions, but point well taken.
Yeah, just a very quick tag on to that. On what page is this? On page 6, I'd written the lit review. It felt like a lit review for the purpose of a lit review, and I think when you're writing for a committee, a dissertation, it's important to actually demonstrate that. But I ended up writing there on my copy of it that I want more focus here. I want to know where are we headed with this? Not just here are the various things people said, and I think if we go back to the comments, when you've got a clear sense of where it's going right off the abstract and the opening of the paper, then that puts less pressure on that on that lit review, and so I think contributed to my making the focus comment.
Okay.
And Michigan.
Yeah, I have a couple questions here. So like some of the other folks here in the workshop, I was wondering if just the mere existence of ethnic parties may bias this analysis somewhat toward peace, because doesn't that imply that they've accepted the central government as legitimate, and whatever grievances they may have left may be directed toward other groups rather than toward the central government? So just kind of why did federal governments emerge in the first place? And then beyond that, on Will's point about the government being the second actor here, that the only way that conflict can emerge in your story is if there's local violence, intercommunal violence on the ground, as far as I read it, and then the central government intervenes. So I was wondering, just on a theoretical level, what can groups do to deter intervention? And do some of these things perhaps correlate with the existence of power-sharing agreements, local autonomy? If, say, a group has local police forces on the ground that can put a lid on local violence, thereby eliminating the need for the central government can intervene, is that something we should worry about? And more broadly, I guess this is a more minor point actually on the way the hypotheses are stated. They seem a little vague on the direction of the relationship. It wasn't clear to me what no substantial or no substantive increase means. How I might falsify this hypothesis? Does that mean that the direction is still positive, just not significant, or just a small effect, or does that mean that you're predicting a flat line? Yeah, and also a relatively minor point in the literature review, works on violence against the central government is lumped together with works on intercommunal violence. So particularly the way they're using Fear on Leighton 1996 is illustrative of that, and also literature on consociationalism and ethnic parties is lumped together with literature on ethnic diversity and conflict. And I thought just a starker contrast can be struck between them. But those are my main one fingers.
Molly?
Should I respond or?
Please, yeah.
Oh, okay. So I think the questions of why federal governments emerge and ethnic parties, and so the whole chain of causality there I think is very important and very difficult to parse out, and I'd appreciate suggestions of ways to address that both theoretically and then empirically, because I mean, most of the literature, and I'm really sorry not to have Dawn here today because I feel like she's done the most important work on this, that the existence of a federal system is not necessarily is likely to be endogenous to the issues of ethnic politics in a country, but to take that into account is something I haven't been able to resolve so much. And then the question, it's interesting, the question of the existence of ethnic parties sort of presumes that the parties have accepted the central government as legitimate. I don't think most of the literature or what I've read of it makes that assumption. I mean, it's not necessarily, I don't know that I would, I mean, sort of empirically thinking about like the Scottish Independence Party and things like that, you know, parties that are actively pursuing independence, whether or not they become connected with violent groups, I would think. I mean, so I don't think it's something that is sort of to be assumed, that the existence of ethnic parties in a federal system participating in the system means that they accord legitimacy to the government altogether.
Okay, we've got Meredith on a two-finger.
Yeah, hi. No, it's really interesting, and I think there's tons of really important policy implications for your work. I just wanted to really quickly go off Yuri's comment about, again, I think this is a framing issue, is when I initially read the paper, I thought there was going to be a discussion of the role of federalism in sort of making, in institutionalizing identity and allowing for easier mobilization. I was thinking of like Lickbach and, does something about federalism allow for collective action around identity that may or may not lead to, violent tactics. And in fact, you give sort of a really good explanation for why, if, there's clientelism, actually we would expect there to be less violence within a working federal system. And so I think if you want to work within, just within federal systems, it might have helped to, again, sharpen up the abstract, because there was a couple sentences in the abstract and in the introduction that made me think at first that you were going to be testing, sort of the impact, the treatment of federalism, which is clearly kind of not where this paper ended up going. And so just maybe sharpening that up, within federal systems.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
Okay, we've got Rob on a one finger, and we've also got Eula on a one finger.
So my one finger turned into a two finger because Yuri beat me to my point. But I don't think that. Okay, so I don't think the hypotheses are all that unclear. I think that they're just you're arguing for a negligible effect, right? Which is something that a lot of people don't get to get away with, absent some relatively delicate tools, right? So everybody knows the example from Fiona Layton 03 where like null effects get asserted and it goes on through just fine. However, it's probably going to be trickier for you to try to advance that. And so one suggestion I had is this is something, we do this all the time. We always have a theory that there should be no effect, and essentially you've got 7 pages of lit review that turn into I'm unconvinced about some of the things that are going on because of this one hole or this one gap. Other than just sort of presenting marginal effects on a 0 to 100 scale so that it looks like there isn't a whole lot of effect even though things are almost doubling, there is some stuff on this. So Carlisle Rainey has a nice AJPS on how to assert a null hypothesis cleanly and then how to assess it. I mean, you're never going to be able to prove it, right? Life sucks, then you die. But you will be able to sort of engage in a little bit more, if you know what the back end of the analysis should look like in an idealized world, it should be easier for you to clarify the argument that leads up to it as well, because you sort of know what the punchline is going to look like in terms of formalized testing. And if you don't know what that is, then you're going to end up with something kind of muddy, which it is in parts. And even though this is the 15th iteration, there might be a much cleaner 16th where you're sort of backward inducing yourself. Also, one finger one while I've got the floor. It seems to me that 2 parties should be qualitatively different than 1 or 0, right? And so the way that things are coded, it's either how many there are, or is it 0 or 1 or more? But 2 is where the competition starts, right? And in your ideal cases, like the 2s are really different than the 1s. So my sense is that you might want to try some different levels, try different combinations of ordinal coding where 2 is privileged a little bit maybe, because a lot of the mechanism that you're talking about is about how intra-ethnic competition affects things, right? So 2 is very special here.
Yeah, I had thought of that and haven't gotten to it yet. It had started earlier in the previous versions and then disappeared, but that's a very useful suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, Eula? You guys are muted.
Yeah. Hi, Molly. I'm Yula. I also wanted to make a comment on what others already know, the confusion of the theory and where the paper is going. And for example, I read in your abstract something about that you wanted to disaggregate the actors and their targets of violence, but then that never occurred again in the theory part or in your lit review part. So I was kind of getting confused what you actually meant with disaggregation, because I thought that what you were going to do was disaggregate the actors, because I think what happened, from my knowledge from a few cases, what happens sometimes is that you have a political party, but then there's also other groups in that ethnic group, like who are maybe more radical and who are dissatisfied by the political process and think it's too passive and not going anywhere, and then they just become more extreme and maybe arm themselves, mobilize, and go into war. So I was, for example, confused by your hypothesis because I wasn't quite sure if you meant that the party itself is going to mobilize and be violent, or if it's actually other actors in that group that are not associated with a party. So for me, that was really not clear, and I think that's a very important distinction to make. So that would be really interesting, I think. And then the other question I had is because I realized that you were actually just talking about a very specific case, which is these parties and federal systems. And so I was asking myself, how much does this actually matter? And I think it would be really useful if you could provide us with, like, in the theory part or even in your introduction, with like a table that gives us the incidence, like the distribution of ethnic conflict across different political systems, because you do make a distinction between democracies, autocracies, federal systems, and maybe unitary systems. So it would be good to know how often do we actually see this kind of conflict, and how much does this matter then that we actually look into this further. So that would also help motivate your piece, I think.
Okay.
And then that also then leads to a methods question that I had, because you talk about a sample, but you actually don't say whether your sample is a random sample or if it's driven by the selection of these authors of the data you're using. And I was just really wondering of what is your sample actually representative, and how does it relate to the universe of cases that you are talking about? So if you could give us actually an idea of the cases that are in your analysis and how they relate to the universe, because I'm not quite sure if you're actually looking at the universe of your cases or just a subsample of them, and then how does that subsample relate to that universe. So I think it would be really helpful to have like a summary of the cases you're looking at in your models, and also some descriptive summary statistics of the variables you're using. So I think, that's my comments.
Great, thank you. Well, on the disaggregation, so I think when I was thinking about the disaggregation, I was thinking about disaggregation of target. So seeing it, so not that just violence happens, but that it's violence against the central government. But I hadn't thought about disaggregating the specific ethnic actor in terms of the violence being committed. I think that would be very interesting and useful, but also probably pretty difficult to parse out. When well, especially given the data that have already been coded, but to even if you had access to, which I kind of more or less could have, access to all the notes, it's often very difficult, right, to tell who, even if the party's advocating violence and sort of stoking it, to be able to tell like exactly who did it. Like if it was the party stoking it and then people just got all excited and were motivated by that mobilization, or if it's truly an external actor that.
Yeah, I mean sometimes it's like, for example, if you look at Kosovo, you have the Democratic League that is kind of following with Vukovac, kind of following the political negotiations, but then some members leave the party and mobilize into the UČK and try to go after their political goals with more violent means.
Right.
So, but then probably that case doesn't apply to your analysis because it's not federal. I guess it's not a federal system in that case.
I don't
think Kosovo relates to the Serbian government, but that doesn't matter. I just think it would be really useful for your hypotheses to clarify when you actually formulate them, who is going to be following the violence, even if you're maybe not able to measure it so clearly. But I think it would be good to know what your theoretical argument is, and then if there's limitations in your empirical design, I think you can defend that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we've got Emilia on a two-finger.
Yes. So I want to now switch my gears from my comments about theory to comments about your research design. Something that became really apparent to me is your relatively unusual treatment of the control variables, because you literally have a half a paragraph on page 20 saying that, you decided to include this set or control variables, and there are many that could be impacting the relationship as well, but you don't want to violate the principle of parsimony. But see, here, because you have such a big literature review and you pinpoint interesting critiques about the arguments in the literature, but then I feel like you dismiss the literature by saying, well, there are many variables, but I'm just going to treat with these here. But why these? You see, if the work of other people plays such an important role in your theory, then I think it should be reflected in a little more careful thinking through your control variables. And I know this is not the main, right? Control variables are what they are, control variables. But I think if you were to strategically think, this is where a lot of people may have some disagreement with you as well. We still, I think, as researchers, quantitative researchers, have to put a thought why we're placing certain control variables in our model. Because just a half a paragraph here, it's just very glaring to me. So
okay, I have about 8 or 9 pages that got cut down just because, you have to culling, what else should be in there. So I have a much longer explanation of the control variables, but I think the point that there could be other useful variables. I think I left it in. And I think I actually kind of messed up the way I cut it. There's a relatively large footnote about other variables that I had included before, and that weren't significant. So I felt like they weren't useful to keep in the model.
But no. What I was saying is not that you need to add more, but you need to explain why those that you have. So interethnic conflict, government violence toward the group, separatist discrimination, regime type, and group concentration. Why are those in there? I still feel that once you really kind of clarify your theoretical argument, you need to place it in the literature and use the literature in a way to give you feedback why these are staying. I don't encourage you to add a bunch of other control variables, because I definitely see the footnote here, but I just need more explanation why did those make it into the model.
Okay.
Jennifer had a two-finger on this. Jennifer, do you want to?
Yeah, actually, it'll be pretty quick. I was going to just, going off of what Emilia said, I do think that you do need more explanation for your control variables, and also more than the footnote of why you left some out, just if for no other reason than to make this a bit more bulletproof. And yeah. I think it's totally fair to put those, to take some of the explanation of the ones that you left out and just reference them and put them in an appendix that you can make available online. But I think there should be a reference to it somewhere, if for no other reason than just to protect yourself there.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So the cue is I have a comment, and then we have Jim on a one finger. So I want to shift to page 9, which is where I think the major meat of the argument gets presented, and there felt to me like a lot more happening there than I was anticipating, and I didn't feel like I got enough detail that I really understood well what you were arguing, and so I just want to share with you what I took away, and see if you can help clarify, either no, you're not talking about that, or explain how this stuff fits together. So there seems to be two different issues on political parties that interest you. One, are they ethnic or not? And second, are they clientelistic or programmatic? And so there I've got 1 2x2. You're also interested in the, I think, ethnic structure of the relationships, such that you have a majority ethnic group in that federal structure, and it's also a minority vis-a-vis the government, which isn't necessarily the case. And but I think you're talking about only being interested in those. And so we then have, right, your majority minority vis-a-vis your majority group vis-a-vis which is a minority vis-a-vis the state, and then if you fit that, then you may or may not have ethnic parties. If you do have ethnic parties, those may or may not be clientelistic versus programmatic. Do I have that?
Well, the close, but and the way the analysis or the theory I put together here more or less assumes that ethnic parties are clientelistic, that they can't be programmatic.
All right, that's important to. Okay, so either I missed it or it's not well enough. It's not clear enough. Okay, and I see. Okay, so that there aren't two different types. Okay. Does it matter whether or not those parties are successful? That didn't seem to come up. You know, they could be minority parties or majority parties in that local governance structure, and it would seem to me that would play a role in the intra-ethnic conflict, as well as potentially the strategies that people are, whether the party itself, going back to an earlier comment, or people who are supporters of a clientelistic ethnic approach to politics.
I haven't. I've thought about it, and I haven't addressed whether or not success is important. Because part of my thing is, like, if they're successful, right, they're going to have probably a lot of impact. So this kind of like the sort of effective number of parties kind of question, right? Like, you can have like 100 parties, but they're not going to all be like effective, right, in any sort of system.
And it seems like the ones that were majorities would be the ones that would have an incentive not to, as you're arguing, right? Have an incentive not to engage the state.
Right.
Whereas if you're a minority party, that incentive ought to at least bite less, I think. Or maybe that isn't a distinction that's important.
Well, so I think theoretically it's important in terms of empirically, because I'm using the
Yeah, I was just thinking theoretically.
Well, I am focusing on minority groups that are minorities within the country.
Okay. That I think could be clarified.
Okay. And fortunately, MAR, as part of its bias, didn't code majority groups until extraordinarily recently, so I don't have any majority groups in the sample.
Okay.
But the reason I hadn't dealt with this success issue, or like effective number of parties kind of idea, is that it seemed to me that even if you had like small unsuccessful parties, that they still could be instigators of like outbidding kind of issues, and might even be more so. And so it wasn't clear to me that if you had a really successful ethnic party, that the effect of outbidding or something would be stronger or different than if you had very small ethnic parties. I couldn't come up with what I think hypothetically that effect would be, because I think at both ends you could have a strong effect of those. A very big ethnic party and a very small ethnic party could instigate like outbidding kind of issues. So I hadn't dealt with success in that way.
Right. Okay. I have Jim on a one finger.
I guess it's a one finger, although someone sort of touched on this with it was someone at the Michigan room, U of M room, about the expectation that there would be a treatment effect investigation of federalism. Just like, I mean, I don't know if this is. It could be, Molly, that you kind of have more than one paper here, you know, and you know, I kind of was expecting at first, reading the abstract, that you would be pooling together both federal and unitary democracies, and then situations under which there are minority groups that have ethnic-based political parties and not. Have you investigated that? I mean, I don't want to give you a suggestion that really kind of goes away from what you're trying to do with this paper, but that just seemed to be kind of the natural question that was out there. So I mean, it was a little bit weird to me. If you were to draw me as a reviewer, I think it'd be good to at least have a discussion about why limiting yourself to looking only at federal democracies is appropriate, and that's kind of really what's going to motivate your analysis. It's good for your analysis.
I'm not just looking at federal democracies. I'm looking at all federal systems, some of which are not what we would, you know, above a 6 on a polity scale.
Oh, that's great. Okay. Maybe I missed that. That's okay.
Yeah,
so
definitely not just looking at democracies. I think that is. I think I do need to clarify that why I'm only looking at federal countries. Part of the reason is because I think that the effects that ethnic political parties, is, you know, empirically testable, are more likely to develop and have power in federal systems because there's a devolution of power to the local level. In unitary systems, I think it's less likely, depending on a lot of demographic issues. But I think the more interesting local level issues would occur in a federal system.
Okay, so you could get pushback on that point, that you would expect it to be more of a salient feature within federal democracy. Something like Israel and other countries which are unitary systems, in which you could argue similar effects are going on. But it would seem to me that even if you were to argue that, even if I was to buy that, you know, this is really a story about federal democracies, I don't understand why it's sort of federal systems in which you have a central government and you have local government. Why is the sample that you're looking at only federal systems? You know, I think, you know, unless what you're saying is, well, but that's not really what my paper's about, though. I mean, if you could, you know, I would say there was two answers to that. Either to sort of look at also the unitary systems, pull them in there, and you have pretty clear hypotheses of what you should expect. What you're saying is that the phenomenon of ethnic-based political parties is something that really is more or less exclusive to federal systems. Is that what you're? Was that what you're saying?
I think that's what I'm saying, but I don't have you know, a firm data on that. I haven't looked at firm data on that. That is what I'm asserting, but I don't. I mean, I thought
it was extremely interesting in the beginning part of the paper when you said, you know, there's these two expectations about what federalism does. One is that it's going to exacerbate the likelihood of rebellion, because I think you say it's the give them an inch, they'll take a mile. They get a little bit of a taste of the ability to sort of organize government at the local level, and that's going to exacerbate separatist desires, right? And then there's an argument that it's kind of like a safety valve, right? It's giving an ethnic group the possibility to politically organize at the local level and have its needs met, and that reinforces the integrity of the system. I don't know how you test that. Maybe that's just not what the paper's about. So like minimize expectation. But if it is what the paper's about, I would think that you have to pool in some non-federal systems to see the treatment.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that, because if you look back to the list that I was looking at, that I mentioned in my previous question, note that I didn't have federal, not federal in there. And the fact that you have federalism in the title really did lead me to anticipate, and then also the arguments that Jim was noting from early on in the paper, that it mattered whether or not you were in a federal system, whether these processes, in other words, that they were going to unfold differently in federal versus not federal. But it seems to me that's not actually what you're arguing, and if that's the case, then I think just a simple rewrite of the paper to something like ethnic politics and anti-regime rebellion in federal systems.
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And then you don't bring up the interesting arguments that Jim noted that cue the reader to think, oh, right. And there's two very simple things. And if that properly characterizes what you're doing, then
yeah. Yeah, I think that would be useful. I'm not interested in contrasting Unitarian federal systems, not at least in this paper. And the reason I'm looking at federal systems mostly is because I think it's a harder test of the theory. Like, I don't expect these things to happen in a unitary system.
Okay. Okay. We have an open queue, and I know Rob had a two-finger that he let slide, and he's shaking his head. No, I don't want to go there. We do. We've got Meredith. So Rob gets away.
So yeah, I'm gonna sort of some of the points that Jim brought up too about federalism, and I think you can actually still have a very interesting and compelling discussion about incentives within federal systems, and why we should not expect identity-based parties on average to lead to violent outcomes. And I think you can even, with like a very like one or two citations to Weingast and sort of Lichtbach, really open up also the importance of this paper. Because the part I found very compelling about your story is not that we shouldn't expect, right, your null finding that we shouldn't expect violence, while important from like political science perspective, I didn't find that as like crazy awesome. It was more the idea of how does clientelism operate under competition, and how it is only in rare circumstances, which you sort of outlined, that we would anticipate this practice of clientelism to lead to violent tactics, right? Like only under these very specific circumstances, when salient parties or mobilized groups are unable to either redistribute goods and services or achieve these goods and services, whatever. Only under these very specific circumstances are they likely to turn to violence within a federal system. And so I think what your paper is actually doing is highlighting why federal systems on average are actually pretty good. And again, I think maybe some broader discussion of domestic incentives at the local level versus the central level could help sort of tease out
the local level. So
yeah, so how, like, why we should expect actually when local leaders are incentivized to both extract revenue from their local constituency and then provide goods and services. If this is operating, the way that it should, without a lot of distortions, you're not going to see people turning to violence, and violence is not going to be an effective sort of a beneficial tactic, because it's just too costly in comparison to what they're getting under sort of non-violent tactics like voting and participation and having a patron that's going to provide them what they want. So yeah, I think, especially anytime you say Weingast, I think people also kind of jump in and see sort of a broader picture here. So, yeah.
Molly, did you want to respond?
No, that's useful. The clientelism plays a big part in the theory, but I think it could be expanded in terms of the expectations at the local level, and maybe even in sort of drawing out the ideal types into hypotheses as opposed to the way the hypotheses are framed now. I think that could be really useful. So thanks.
Okay, and we have Rob on a 1 or a 2.
1.5.
It doesn't matter. We'll call it a 1.5.
So going back to sort of incentives and everything, right? So the word costs comes up on page 13. Mm-hmm. And you say, well, it has to be the case that the violence outweighs the costs, but it could well be that sort of like the costs of violence are they vary across these different ideal types that you've drawn together, right? So like in particular, if you have to be killing people from your own blood, then in the future suppose that there is some new coalescence or something within your group, then you've just killed off a lot of your potential supporters or whatever. So there's opportunity costs, there's destruction costs. I mean, I obsess about these things more than I should. But given that we've now broached the subject of incentives, it could well be that there's some interesting variation in the disincentives, and this would make the theory a little bit clearer in terms of differentiating some of those ideal types that seem a lot more similar than you're trying to pitch them as different sometimes. And if you can manage to make the point that, yeah, in this particular case with intra-ethnic competition, the costs are going to be, even if they are dynamic hypothetical costs or whatever they may be, there might be some interesting story to tell there, because I don't think there's going to always be enough interesting variation in the incentives, although Meredith just put some good meat on that bone. I don't think there'll always be enough interesting variation in the incentives to get away with the entire menu of ideal types, especially if you do end up trying to turn this into something a little bit richer and maybe a little more comprehensive. So you might want to talk about interesting variation in costs, and it wouldn't be that hard to think about opportunity costs and destruction costs and how they both map into these ideal types.
Yeah. So how would you? I mean, then how would you test that?
I wouldn't even be worried about testing yet. I would have a model, but that's probably just playing into it.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. We have an open queue unless I've missed someone. And if not, I'm going to jump in with actually. So this is just a tone point, Molly, but I think on page 7, you state that there's several places where just in your phrasing you state things more strongly than I think is going to be helpful to you in terms of building an audience for the work. So on page 7, you write that others in the field made a logical leap without specifying any mechanism. You can soften that easily by saying, without changing the meaning, without specifying clear mechanisms, or something like that. Down below, I contend that there is no reason to think that. Really, no reason ever. People who publish stuff, you know what I'm saying? I mean, it's just you don't have to say it that strong. There's another.
I generally tend towards not saying things very strongly, and so I've been encouraged to be more.
Oh, interesting. Okay. All right. Well.
But I'm not necessarily comfortable with that. I've just been following advice that I've received. So.
Well, there's others. Others can weigh in on this. Then let me actually ask the panel if they'd be willing to do that.
Mm-hmm.
On the bottom of page 10, you use the phrase "defies basic rationality." And I'm thinking. I don't know. Okay. Both from a strategic, but I'm curious. So Rob, you seem to think you tend to agree. Jennifer, what's your?
I think the tone is very much somebody that had written this in a weaker tone that was encouraged to write it in a stronger tone. It's sort of like there's some times where the anger feels a little artificial, and it might be better to just keep your foot on the jugular, but don't crush it, but just make sure you're constantly exerting pressure against the literature without provoking it too much.
Okay.
Because it is sort of like in patches. There's little patches of anger, and then there's retreat.
That's right. That's right, Emilia?
Yes, so I wanted to comment on this as well, because when I was reading that paper, I literally went, oh, because I got the phrases and they were a little on the offensive side, I have to say.
Okay.
But Molly, I'm going to tell you something. Having been trained as a quantitative scholar, I have to learn for the past, several years how to say what I really want to say without being offensive, without being supportive, but not critical too much of people. And it's partly about being a strategic writer, how to write, but I think it's an art of knowing how to convey what you really want to say without offending people. And I get it that you were advised, and it's a style, but imagine if some of those people that you use those phrases like this were your reviewers. You know, it may set you up for failure because I'm just going to do, oh, and they're just going to be very angry, right? So I think it's a fine line.
Okay, thank you.
If anybody else want to comment on that? Jennifer? Yeah.
Sorry, I had to unmute. Yeah, I think that it is a matter of like finding that fine line of being provocative. So you want to be provocative, but you don't want to, excuse the term, you don't want to piss people off because, and I think that's hard, especially when you tend not to, if you tend to be a little milder in your phrasing. Typically, I think it is basically, I think what Rob was saying. It's just a matter of finding that balance. But I would encourage you to maintain a provocative claim, but just not be so, it almost sounds like you're being disparaging of other people's work. And so that, I would try to get rid of anything disparaging. Just say, maybe they didn't consider this, or it's just that kind of thing. I don't know how well I'm saying that.
Okay, great. We have Jim on one thing.
Yeah, I guess I had a couple of other points on this. One is kind of a cheap shot. I mean, I used MAR myself in my own work. You know, you mentioned the selection bias problem with that is a common criticism of MAR, and you mentioned it as that there's a selection bias in favor of larger groups. If I'm correct about that, my understanding is that an additional selection issue is that groups were selected into MAR based on the propensity to be at risk of conflict, right? I don't know what to tell you about this because I don't know. There are people out there that don't like MAR, and so I don't know what I would do if this were my paper. I think I would be prepared though to say, I mean, does that set up a conservative test of your hypothesis? These are groups that are likely to be in conflict. You don't find that. Well, I don't know whether or not you should preempt and sort of say that, or what.
Well, so the selection bias wasn't. There were they weren't selected in terms of being at risk of conflict, okay, but there ended up being a higher percentage than the general population of ethnic groups for rebellion.
Okay.
Which is part of the problem. So the way I've kind of tried to get around that and try to explain it as succinctly as possible, in the selection bias correction data set, I selected all of the federal countries or non-unitary countries out of that group, and then any of those groups that were also in those countries that were in the original MAR data set were also included. So it presumably corrects for the selection bias in, probably not perfectly, but then I also weighted the countries as well, or the groups as well. So, I mean, MAR is MAR, and you're right, there are people who just don't like MAR, but I feel like I don't know that there's anything else that anyone has ever done that I could do to make it better.
That's kind of where I land on this too. I just don't know if you're going to run into any haters out there, but I mean that's one. The other thing is that MAR.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Can I jump in on it too there? I just want to reiterate something that Eula and some others mentioned earlier, which I had a comment on as well, which is I do think some descriptives on representativeness could go a long way, and I also want to encourage you to piggyback on something Jennifer said earlier in terms of an online appendix to talk more about what the AMAR correction is, because you're much more familiar with that, particularly since it hasn't yet been published, than most people are. I don't know that you're going to have a lot of space to do more than you're already doing in the paper, but letting the reader know there's more that they can read online, I think.
Well, hopefully that paper will definitely be published before this one ever is.
That's true.
Okay, so also within MAR, I wonder, this is something that I think Emilia might have said don't do, which is don't add more controls. I kind of wondered if I kind of thought you have concentration in there, which I think makes a lot of sense. what about, MAR has codes for whether or not a group has kin outside the country. I wonder if there's a way to kind of also, I would imagine that external support by kin in other countries or external support by a state or something would have to be something you want to control for. I don't know that big of it. I don't think it's a huge deal, but I mean, that's something to think about.
Yeah.
Legacy of political exclusion, I wonder if you could sort of do that as well. You would just match that up by the country. You could use EPR for that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I just wondered if there was something like that. The final thing is that I wonder if you were to draw as a reviewer someone like Michael Ross or one of his students,
Mm-hmm.
would you, their work is all about how natural resources, resource rents and revenues, they're an important part of the decision of a group to engage, to decide strategically to pursue separatism. The argument there is that, there's a division of the revenue, but the ethnic group that is being cut into the division can never really know what the true value of that revenue is. And so separatism, wanting to be your own country and walking with some of the resource is a strategically advantageous thing to do. I don't know if you can control for whether or not it's an oil producing state or is there oil in the region where they live. It would be hard to do, just to kind of make sure that you've covered the bases. This paper is at the intersection of a lot of different literatures, and that's kind of one of them. And that's, I don't know if that makes the paper less coherent, but I just would wonder if that would be a conservative strategy for you to make sure that you would cover all your bases.
Okay. Yeah, you're right. I don't think it would be hard to do at all to incorporate something like that, either externally or with maybe within MAR. Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I was having mouse problems there. We have an open queue, and Jennifer, right on cue, has got a comment for us. Jennifer.
Hi. One thing that I thought about when I was looking at the ideal types, which again I really did find very interesting, an interesting part of your argument, and I wonder what the others think of this idea, but sometimes it's nice when you're describing a hypothetical situation to provide an actual case that exemplifies that. And I don't think it would be too hard to do, but I just wanted to throw that out there as a suggestion, something that I think might make the reading a little bit more, the paper a little bit more accessible, because like Emilia, this is not my area, I'm a little out of my comfort zone here, and that would have made it would have just been easier and more accessible, I think.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. Like I said, the ideal types are a very recent addition because I felt like the paper really helped with clarity. So I hadn't really even gotten beyond the sort of like, oh yeah, hey, this thing's like a good idea to add.
Okay, I've got Emilia and then you on two fingers.
Yes, so I want to definitely encourage you, Molly, to add some sort of a case to illustrate maybe your causal mechanisms. I think it would make me feel a lot more confident about your theory in general, and I think it's also not only beneficial for this paper because you do kind of do a lot of quantitative analyses, and we're just thinking about adding control variables and all those things, but in order to make the paper just flesh out the causal mechanism, I think adding a nice case with perhaps some in-depth interviews would go a long way, and it's also very strategic. When in my work, I mean, I do a lot of quantitative work, but then I throw in an interview or a case study, and all of a sudden I'm able to address people, a wider audience, and they will be more on your side.
Well, so let me ask you this. When you're starting to talk about rebellion and things that are like get people in trouble, I'm not sure. I did interviews for my dissertation that this partly comes out of, but it was addressing more sort of outbidding targeting as opposed to like groups rebelling. I mean, so I've never interviewed rebels. That seems like challenging. Or I guess I can interview all the parties that don't rebel because I don't think that they're not rebelling. But that seems less accessible to me at this point. I mean, what kind of interview? I mean, you know what I mean?
Think about what's the most important thing in your theory that may be very vulnerable to a criticism or something that you really want to sell across. And then, I mean, I would still encourage you to start thinking how you may incorporate some interview. I mean, if you have conducted those already for your dissertation and you have the transcript, I'm sure, done, read them and see how it can apply to this article, especially that you have done them already. It's just an additional material to help you flesh out the causal mechanism. That's just, you know, and I know some interviews may not be very comfortable to do. I mean, I go into Sharia colleges or law, you know, with my head covered, but it helps us and helps the research.
Okay. Well, and then I guess the other thing is since my argument is sort of about non-causality, right, that I think that I'm not going to find the effect. So it's hard to think about how I would structure that interview, but I think it's a useful suggestion for supporting the argument.
Eula?
Yes, I wanted to say I fully agree with Jennifer that I would also, if you could provide case examples of the different ideal types that you are presenting, that would be really useful. And I was also wondering, as I was reading your theory part, to flesh out the mechanism that has been so confusing for most of us, I guess. Maybe you could provide like a graphical visualization of the mechanism as you see it, and maybe it won't make the final cut into the paper, but I think it would help you to map out the theory to your readers, and maybe the graphical visualization would even help to like get rid of some of that confusion, and maybe it will even make the cut. I always find that very useful.
Yeah, I've had that in there. But I think. Sorry. So I have a graphic. And no one else thinks it is. So perhaps I could amend it and make it more useful to visualize the
Okay. The queue is open. Dying to jump in? Looking down. We're good. Okay. Molly, you've got a group of us here. Do you have anything you would like to ask our reaction to? Put any issues on the table. You've tossed out a couple before. I hope we've answered them, but feel free to revive one if we didn't.
No. Well. A lot of the things that I find problematic or that needs addressed, you also found, not surprisingly, also keyed on those things. So, and a lot of the suggestions are really useful, a lot to think about that I'm not exactly sure how I will go about addressing, but absolutely need to be addressed. In terms of, I mean, I'm junior in this process, so I don't necessarily know how many times how far do I keep going? I mean, you can always keep revising. How much revision? How much change? I feel like I could probably write several papers out of the comments that I've gotten today, and really, really very interesting ones that go in similar directions, but not the same direction. So. I guess getting this feedback is incredibly useful because other venues I've pitched it to haven't been as thorough in feedback. But so I guess my question is, how far do you go in revising it before you just put a seal on it and send it somewhere?
That's a great question. I think because I can speak just from my own personal experience. The very first paper that I actually submitted for review was a co-authored piece I wrote with a guy named Keith Jaggers, and Keith was in the same year as I was in graduate school, and the manuscript, with the two of us going back and forth, actually reached a point where I remember reading a draft of it and feeling like I had no idea who had written it, because it surely couldn't have been me. And Keith had the same reaction, and we both became convinced, well, it must be getting actually pretty good. And that's when we pestered our advisor, Ted Gurr, with it. But I don't find personally that really works if I'm not writing with other people. That I think it's much harder to get a handle on when you're doing solo work. And I'll let others comment on this as well. And so I think finding someone external, whether that's somebody from your committee or that's somebody else that you've met, who can help give you that thumbs up until you over time start to develop a better feel for being able to evaluate your own work. I mean, for what it's worth, I know Eric Kartsky, I don't know if he speaks differently about it because I've talked to him in about 5 or 6 years about it, but the preceding many years I talked to him about it, he always feels like he has no idea which papers of his are good or bad relative to any of the other papers he's ever written. And so that always struck me as, well, okay, Eric's an outlier on that one. That felt extreme. But there definitely is variation across that. And I don't, the bad news, I guess, is I don't know of any hard and fast rules. When writing with other people, I feel like I can tell. When writing on my own, I really don't. And looking for others who can, one or more others who can give me that feedback that I can have confidence in is the approach that I've always taken. Let me ask others for their reaction. Yeah, just go ahead and jump in.
So I agree with Will that when you're writing a solo paper, it's a little more difficult to be critical, but there comes a point that the paper is just collecting dust, and we can always get better in writing something. So you have to use your own judgment. What I do, I write the paper, and if I'm satisfied, I take it to the workshop, and I just let it sit for a week, not looking at it. Then after a week, something happens in my brain, and I can be more critical. After a week, I reread it, redo it, and finally I get sick and tired of it and send it.
Okay, thanks.
Jim, you got to weigh in here because we got some other. I know Rob's probably thinking I'm in the same boat. I don't know if Jennifer's willing to, how willing she is to promote herself. But Jim, you got to talk.
I just think you just develop the way you learn to publish is to submit and get rejected. I mean, that's just kind of the way I learned, and you'll develop a sense for when a paper's ready, and that sense will be, 75% accurate. I mean, it's frequent to get papers that you think are ready to go, and they just strike out of the first couple of journals. This paper, I don't think is ready. I can tell you. I think it needs to be much more focused. I think it does. You need some more revisions here. I mean, this really needs to. The language needs to be tightened up a little bit. I think the best papers are the ones where you read the abstract, you read the first sentence, you know exactly what the paper's going to be about. If you could sort of make that your goal, I think then it's closer to being ready. It's just trying to do a lot. I think it's not. I wouldn't. I wouldn't submit it just yet. I think you need a little bit more time with it. Could you tell me where you're thinking about sending it when it's ready?
Probably JCR.
Okay.
That's
like a JCR type.
Right. That's my thought. That's but I welcome suggestions if that.
You might also consider CPS. There is sort of a institutional features kind of thing with this.
Mm-hmm.
CPS is a long backlog.
Okay.
Okay. ISQ is another. I mean, you have a lot of good places you can go with this for good and fast reviews, but I just don't think you're ready yet. You don't want to burn. You don't want to send to ISQ, get rejected. You can't go back with it. And so I think you need just a little bit. I think you need some surgery.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay. I think that that's a really good question about when is something ready to be sent out, and I'm terrible at it. I wait way too long before I send stuff out sometimes, and I'm trying to get better about that. But one thing that I have found helpful is like when you're getting suggestions from people and they're similar suggestions, like you got a lot of comments about the focus, reframing parts of it. Those are similar comments, so those are very actionable, not pulling you in all different directions, I don't think. But when you start to get a bunch of like different nitpicky things when you get feedback, that may be when it's time to send it out.
Okay. Great, thanks.
Okay, let's give you. We've got a few more minutes left, Molly. If you have anything else that you'd like to throw our way.
Well, I mean, in terms of the empirical analysis, we talked about it to some extent, but is MAR going to be a big problem? I mean, that's come up before. If it is there a suggestion about how to, like, I mean, I could in theory adapt some of the variables to EPR and use EPR, which seems to be in more vogue these days. Is that something that is worth doing, or is it something that is just it would take so much effort that it wouldn't be that beneficial?
I can't in real time think through a reasonable estimate of the effort, and that's going to have an impact. But I think that you can and should do a better job of selling AMAR. And as I would, to reiterate what Jim was saying, I would work on just trying to clarify the theoretical story and clean up the presentation, stuff like title, abstract, really nail that down. And then where I was talking on page 9, and some of the other ideas you've got, possibly about the ideal types. Clean that up so that's clearer. That's more important. Okay. Once that's all done, then I would try to give some attention to where early on in the paper are you going to explain why the standard expectations about MAR no longer apply or don't apply to your design. And I think that will be important. That's part of what AMAR is also going to be doing, and we don't yet know how the community is going to receive it, right? In terms of my reaction to the EPR suggestion, again, I can't think it through on the fly, so I'm not going to bother trying, but I think if you could show that you get robust results to an alternative measurement strategy using EPR, or perhaps even blending, again, it's an opportunity cost question, but that to me would strengthen the paper. So I think it's worth exploring. Whether it's worth actually doing is just going to depend on how costly it is. And let me open it to others. Just go ahead and jump in if you are ready.
Molly, I think that's good advice that Will's giving you. I would follow that, and I think that I'm not sure, unless you know much more about MAR than I do. I've used it, but it's not something I use all the time. I don't think you could do this with EPR. EPR is not a group level database, correct? I mean.
Yeah, I think it can be. I haven't worked with it. I've looked at it, but I haven't worked with it. I think it can be. I think I think it's they're national aggregates, right? They're national aggregates of, political exclusion, the size of. I don't know. But I thought that there was a version that is at the group level. In some ways analogous to MAR from looking at it previously, but I don't know for.
I mean, the dilemma that you're in and that we're in is that MAR is a disputed, it's not the perfect tool, but we don't really have anything else. I mean, it's not like it's. I don't think I've ever come across anything like it, and so maybe do a little bit of investigation about EPR so that you're ready when a reviewer says. Mm-hmm. Why don't you use EPR data? Well, EPR does not have structured the way I need it to be, and I really can't do what I need to do with that. And I think that in addition to what Will said, which is just to kind of make it clear that the selection issues are something you're thinking about, and you just don't think that it's affecting your results in a way that is important. You can't really control what people are going to think about the bias someone's going to have against the database. It's
Right. Okay.
All right. Well, I want to thank each and every one of you for Molly for submitting your work, and especially to each of you who have jumped in, particularly this time of the semester. We got finals next week, and I don't know what your semester, those of you who are teaching, this is a tough time of year to get people to volunteer their time. So we're thankful to everybody who volunteers their time to make this workshop happen, but especially this time of year. So sorry we weren't able to have Dawn with us. She has sent an email with her comments to the group, for those of you who know folks who are junior, those of you yourself who want to submit work, we're going to put out the call in the next week or so. It'll be open through the end of the month we should probably do about 6, maybe even 7 sessions for the spring. So keep an eye out for that call.
Will, can I ask how junior? I mean, do you
untenured? Okay,
but not graduate students.
No graduate. Yeah, anyone who we actually even did one master's student, though. The competition will probably be sufficiently stiff in the future. We didn't have a whole lot of applications, so one of our early ones. And anyone who is, you've got to actually have the paper, right? So we do make. It's not like an APSA or whatever, not an abstract. And then we try to pick the best, most interesting papers that we can find that we think will benefit. And we don't do interstate conflict. It's all intrastate conflict, which is, we need to do a better job pointing that out. But hopefully our next call will. Good. So, all right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.